Now we're going to take a political journey, backwards and into the future. Stephen, as soon as we get you ready, ready to go.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for waiting. For those of you who've stayed all the way to the end, congratulations, you made it. I want to thank Carissa. Where are you, Carissa? Are you still here? And Mary and Kurt and everybody who made this great seminar work. I know how hard it is to put on a conference or a seminar, and it takes a lot of breaking work just to pull it off, and this came off extremely well. Very, very pleased with all the work you did. Thank you, Larry. And I'd like to thank the Academy. Quite literally, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences is the reason I am here. I edited a couple volumes of Daedalus on energy, actually the alternative energy future. And Larry found one of those articles, gave me a call. I checked out what this was about. It sounded fascinating. How could I say no? And I'm very happy I came. It's been an amazing 2 days. My brain is full. I'm not sure I can get through my talk. I have so many other things going on in there right now. But I want to talk to you about how I came into this world, because I'm not really an energy researcher. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a chemist. I'm not a biologist. I'm a political scientist, which makes a lot of physical scientists squirm when they hear the word. But, you know, I'll hide behind Aristotle, so we'll go back to the great ones. He gave us the name, quite literally. He named the discipline. So how did I end up doing energy research, of all things? In 2001, I was running a project called the Caltech-MIT Voting Technology Project. It was trying to regroup after the 2000 election. Chuck Vest and David Baltimore had conceived of this project. It was a fantastic project. And we were trying to work through all the problems that many of you saw on TV in Florida. And I got another call at about the same time from my friend Paul Joskow, and he said, we need your help on a project. John Deutsch and Ernie Moniz are starting a new study of nuclear power, and we have a governing group, and they say that John and Ernie have put the cart before the horse. And I said, well, let's meet. And we met, and I heard what their idea was, and it sounded absolutely insane. And it was absolutely insane. John and Ernie wanted to build 400 nuclear power plants in the United States by 2050. How many power plants are there? 100. And given transmission lines, where do you put power plants? Near cities, right? So imagine quadrupling the number of nuclear power plants in the United States in 50 years. We haven't built a new nuclear power plant since the 1980s in the United States. And the politics of building nuclear power plants, or any nuclear power, or any power plant of any sort, are so complicated, getting back to the complex systems problem, that this seemed like a total pipe dream. We went ahead with a study, you know, something so crazy, how could I say no, just like this invitation. I was brought on to do public opinion research. Tell us what the public wants. In fact, the National Science Foundation had gotten so bored with nuclear power that they stopped funding any survey work on nuclear power, because the answer was always the same: no, 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 we don't want it. The only outfit that was surveying in this area at the time was the nuclear energy industry. So if you wanted to know what the American public thought about nuclear power circa 2001, the only source was the nuclear energy industry for any information. So we started polling on this question, and what we found was that about 40% of the public were against expanding nuclear power, and about 40% were for it, and 60% were against it, which is a little tick up from the 1970s and 1980s, but not a good story for what John and Ernie wanted to do, because where they wanted to lead us was not going to be very palatable with the American public. There was a kind of silver lining to this, which is that coal, which is the #1 source of electricity in the United States, was less popular than nuclear power. Okay? So where we are in energy, at least where we were at that time, was a very complicated problem, at least from the perspective of a political scientist who's trying to think through what we should be doing. The problem, the whole reason for doing this study, though, was not about building new nuclear power plants. It was about solving or beginning to solve the problem of climate change. In fact, it wasn't clear why you'd study energy at all if it was not for that problem. My involvement in that project led me to another project, which was the coal study, even more depressing subject. I began working with engineers at that point and trying to teach them how to be political scientists, how to really think like a political scientist. Because we're different from most other scientists. Maybe we're similar to doctors. Because ultimately what we want to do is we want to interact in a complicated system like Ian was just describing, but we don't want to study it. We want to change it. And it wants to change us. So imagine the NIH cuts your budget completely. Zero. That's what happened to us this year. Like NSF zeroed us out. So we survive. We deal with it. We adapt to it. We look for other places. In the coal study, we started working with engineers who were interested in carbon capture and sequestration. And engineers, if you've really worked closely with them, are the most optimistic people in the world. They will solve any problem. My older daughter's in college at a small liberal arts college in Eastern Washington. Very happy to be there. What she discovered at the beginning of her sophomore year at a very small liberal arts college is she wants to be an engineer. Why? Because she wants to use physics and calculus to solve problems. Any problem. And that's the engineer approach. Unfortunately, engineers also think that everyone else in the room thinks like them and knows what they know and is ready to march behind them. And I've never had a zero, an actual zero in a survey in which no one in the survey would actually even admit that they didn't know the answer to a question, but that was the case with carbon capture and sequestration. No one in America knows what this technology is or will even guess what it is. That was a real eye-opener for the engineers who were working on this project with us because they felt, just like John and Ernie with nuclear power, that the American public was going to start marching behind carbon capture and sequestration. The Obama administration started, or the Obama campaign in 2008 started going down that same path. So what I do to pull out from these two studies is to try to find openings. Where can we move the discourse forward? Where can we move public policy forward? Because most of the time, unlike the ecologists, we're stuck. Most of the time, we're going nowhere. Things are in stasis because there's so many competing forces in politics that nothing moves forward. In fact, the entire American political system was designed precisely for that reason. It is designed for stasis. That was the original idea that Madison had. So I'm forever searching for policies that might be supported by the public over the long run. What's sustainable? What can we put in place that the next administration won't just revoke, right? And the first 4 years or so that I worked on energy, so from 2000 to 2005, I did a number of surveys. I published 0 because it was such a depressing topic that I couldn't move forward. I was stuck in that regard. I couldn't put a single word to paper that was anything other than a report to the group I was working with because I felt it would be counterproductive. It would not help the nation move forward. So what I want to talk to you about is how I got to the point of seeing a world that is different. And in fact, it's a world that I think we're at now, and we're starting to move in that direction. So it's finally, I think, a hopeful picture about the politics of climate change, not just the energy or the technology or the engineering. And actually, I'm very surprised at where I ended up and where my colleagues in economics and engineering have ended up, because we all seem to be converging on the same set of answers. And they're different from the answers we thought we'd start off with, and they're different from the answers that I think we had in mind all the way up until 2009. So let me turn to 2009, because this is my ecology. This is, what was the name of the person who studied marmots? All right. Dan Bloomstein studies marmots. These are my marmots. Does anybody know who these two people are? Henry Waxman was one of the most distinctive noses in Congress. And the one on the left is John Dingell, who set all sorts of endurance records. John Dingell's father was elected to the House of Representatives in 1933, I think. He died in 1955, and his son won a special election to fill his seat in Detroit, Michigan's 15th congressional district. And Dingell represented that district all the way until this past year, setting all sorts of kind of amazing records. If you want to study somebody's DNA, that guy, because how did he live in that high-stress environment for that long? What's in his intestines? The Dingell-Waxman parallel, though, is pretty interesting. Waxman was elected in 1974. The Watergate class comes to Congress. Very active liberal voice in Congress. Dingell is just powerful. I don't describe him as particularly liberal. He's a big friend of GM, but he's also a big friend of the unions. So it's a very complicated character. Dingell becomes chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the second most powerful committee in Congress, and it's the second most powerful committee because anything that has to do with the U.S. economy, anything that has to do with regulation, has to go through his committee. He gets to touch it. In 2008, it was clear that energy was going to be on the agenda, and Dingell was an enemy to the energy bill. Any energy bill, it was going to be schemed up because it was going to hurt Detroit. It was going to hurt the unions, it was going to cost some jobs, it was going to hurt GM. So Nancy Pelosi had a problem on her hands. How are they going to move forward with an energy bill after the 2008 election if John Dingell was chairman of Energy and Commerce? So she told Dingell to step aside. Right? She said, you need to move aside, and we want Waxman to take over. And Dingell refused. And ultimately, they had a vote in the caucus. It was 132 to 122, and Henry Waxman replaced John Dingell, all to set up the energy bill. Does anybody know who was the sponsor of the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, in the House? John Dingell, along with Charlie Rangel. So time was running out in 2009. We had two acts, both before Congress. We had the ACA and the Energy Act. Both were in the House. By the end of the summer, they were out of the House. And Waxman seemed to have won. He'd won his bill. He really pushed for the Waxman Markey bill. It was an important piece of legislation. The centerpiece of the Waxman Markey bill was to put a price on carbon through a cap and trade system. That is, Congress would impose a cap on how much carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions would occur, and those would be that cap would be translated into tradable pollution permits. We'd set up a market. There are a couple markets like that. In my area, there's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, which is a tradable market system for setting a price on carbon. California just adopted one. Europe has one. The European system is trading at about $12 a metric ton, which will be an important fact when we come back to it. The ACA had also gotten out of the House, but there was a problem with the ACA, which is called the number 60. You need 60 votes to close debate in the Senate. And Kennedy was sick, and Harry Byrd was sick. They only had 58. And it was going to be a very difficult fall and spring, coming into 2010, to get both bills passed through the Senate. So the administration had to make a choice, and the choice it made was to move forward with the ACA and to kill the energy bill. So the energy bill died, and the ACA moved forward, much to the consternation of the environmentalists all over the United States, and much to the consternation of many people in the medical societies that I have heard all over the United States. I think there was another reason that the ACA succeeded and the energy bill died, which was that the energy bill wasn't really ripe. It was an odd bill. Stuff was getting added to it at the last minute. They were trying to make a deal. It wasn't ready to be passed. And it's a complicated, sufficiently complicated area of politics and policy that it deserves some attention as to what are the two issues. So for me, 2009 was a very weird year for another reason, which is when I really came into my own and really started to follow politics closely was 1977. I remember this year extremely well. I really was riveted by the issues of the day. The issues of the day were healthcare and energy. This was like watching all the TV I watched as a kid all over again. It was all coming back to me. But the whole situation really seemed to be summed up by two graphs, the tale of two graphs that really tell us why healthcare and why energy remain on the agenda. So this is a graph from the Kaiser Family Foundation. It's reproduced everywhere, and it tells us the tale of why everyone in DC at least is so obsessed with healthcare, which is that it continues to grow as a percentage of our GDP, expenditures, costs, whatever you want to put up there. It's always going up, and it threatens to gobble up everything else in the economy if it just keeps going. So my economics friends tell me. And we can look at it as care expenditures as a share of GDP. We can look at it as costs. We can look at it as public obligations in the future. All these things are growing in a predictable and unfortunate way. It's like watching a car accident happen in very slow motion. We can see what's going to happen in 10, 15 years to the US economy if we don't somehow contain the costs. But this is the same argument I was hearing in 1977. Right? This is just deja vu all over again, to quote the great Bard. So why is energy on the agenda? It's not the 1970s, right? Real energy costs, real energy prices, if you take oil, if you take electricity, are low and falling. We're paying 2/3 of what we were paying in 1980 for any energy, right? Just average all the energy costs. We are much more efficient in our use of energy. We're using a quarter what we used in 1960 to produce the same amount of gross domestic product. Right? It's astonishing. Right? This does not get discussed quite as much, and energy imports have fallen dramatically. We're not importing nearly as much oil as we did back in the 1970s, around 1980, and there's the prospect now, because thanks to hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling, that we'll be exporting oil in the next 5 years in a significant amount. It's like, wow, this is a different world. Whoop. Yeah. So this is a second graph. Looks like the first graph. It's carbon in the atmosphere, measured at the Hawaii station in Mauna Loa. And it shows continual increase in carbon concentrations in the atmosphere. I'm going to skip the slide showing you the main cause for a lot of that, which is man-made. And we are not in the 1970s. This was a problem people were just thinking about. In the 1970s, people weren't sure if this was going to cause warming or cooling. Now we have a really solid scientific consensus that this is causing warming, which is going to have a series of effects. I used to run, when I was at MIT, a series of meetings for congressional staff. We'd bring the senior congressional staff out of DC, it's important to get them out of DC, to talk about policy issues, any specific policy issue, and we'd choose one issue, and we'd bring the best technologists in the room to teach the staff. And one year we did climate change, it was 1998. And we talked about causes, we talked about energy, we got to consequences, and the person who was like our lead guy, going to really nail it on consequences, started talking about how deciduous forests were going to start shifting to the north, and that would have big effects on tourism in New England. It's like, just drop the football. But at that time, scientists weren't really sure what was going to happen, and we have a lot of unpredictable consequences. Here's a pretty interesting map. This is Florida. If we have 3 meters of sea level rise, which seems to be about what the 2120 projection might be. These are the coastal areas that will be either inundated or threatened so that when there's a storm, they will be inundated. Where's Miami? Can you see Miami on there? There's Miami. The red is underwater. So things like this are starting to come out. What happens once you get coastal inundation? Well, marshes are going to start to fill up again. What happens when marshes fill up again? The bugs are going to start coming back. What happens when the bugs start coming back? They're going to start spreading diseases. So you're going to have a cascade of effects that are going to happen in response to this. Basically, this is the nastiest externality problem human society's encountered. Maybe the superbugs are similar, but it's the same kind of problem. It's an externality. The things that we're doing are producing outcomes. We're not really responsible for the things we're doing because it's not reflected in the costs of anything we do. Right? So the cost of carbon is not priced in the price of electricity we pay. It's not priced in the price of gasoline that we pay. And the idea behind cap and trade was let's try to build that price into the economy somehow. Greenhouse gas emissions are cumulative. Whatever we put up this year, it's going to be up there for 10,000 years. They're not distinguishable. The Chinese carbon is the same as the American carbon. Same with other greenhouse gases. I don't want to single out carbon. The effects of potential climate change are intergenerational. They're not going to affect my generation so much. They'll start to affect my kids' generation. They'll really affect my grandkids' generation. The trade-off then is, am I going to accept lower quality of living for my grandkids' generation? Even though I don't know quite what's going to happen to my grandkids' generation, because those consequences are not very predictable. It's not clear. They're also very distributional. We heard a bit about differences across different societies in the world. The US is not going to be affected so badly. Canada might even be better off, right? Because the Northwest Passage will finally be navigable. There are already land speculators buying up parts of northern Canada that have been ice-locked for many, many centuries. Bangladesh is in big trouble. So the parts of the world that are big emitters right now are not necessarily going to be the ones that are going to suffer the most. The challenge is actually a really specific and I think quite simple challenge. And I'll pull a graph from one of the other pieces from Daedalus that I don't think Larry read, because it's from the first issue. Oh, okay, right. This is from my friend Michael Greenstone and Adam Looney, and this is on getting the price of carbon right, or the price of our energy activities right. And what it shows is for different modes of producing electricity, come back here. This is existing coal power plants. How much we pay, those bars come out as gray, they're blue. So how much we pay in real terms is on the bottom. We pay about 3 cents per kilowatt hour for an existing coal power plant on your electricity bill. That's what you'd see in terms of your energy use in the end. The typical person's electricity bill is about $100 a month, so that's your price, roughly, because it's half of our electricity. New natural gas power plants here cost us about 5.5 cents. So build a new natural gas power plant, at least when these calculations were made, and it's much more expensive than an existing coal power plant. To make natural gas competitive with coal, you have to eliminate that 5.5 cent versus 3 cent gap. That is what fracking has allowed us to do. Fracking has gotten rid of that gap. New natural gas is replacing coal at a very rapid clip. It's extremely good news if you're concerned about the climate. There are other issues to worry about. I don't want to understate them. But what this says is that if we can eliminate this gap, that amount, we can start to drive coal out of the market. The reason we want to drive coal out of the market is that this bar here is the IGCC, the Intergovernmental panel on climate change, yeah. This is their estimate of the net present value of carbon emissions from coal, this amount here. That's a pretty big chunk of change. Here it is from natural gas. So this difference is the net gain we're going to have just if we can get natural gas onto the market. And that's what fracking has allowed us to do. It's really going fast, squeezing out quickly. There's another element to this, though, and this is the essence of the Greenstone and Looney article, and I think this is a really, really important insight. There are a lot of other external costs associated with coal. We heard about one of them, acid rain. Particulates, major cause of asthma. Mercury. Half the mercury in the oceans, roughly, is estimated to be ultimately from coal-fired power plants all over the world. Last year, the EPA finally put in place their mercury emission standards. Big deal in terms of stemming mercury in the environment. So what we want to do is somehow capture that price as well as that price. So what Waxman Markey, I think, missed was its obsession with that price and a complete ignorance of this price. And this price is much bigger. So how do we change the price? How do we change the price? Well, there are different ways to change the price. But the objectives of changing the price are, one, change your behavior. If it becomes more expensive, people are going to use less electricity, regardless. It'll drive out the worst emitters if you can price it. It'll drive out coal. And it'll make other technologies that have low carbon or low other kinds of pollution much more competitive, like nuclear power, wind, and solar. And it will cause innovation. If there is an economic incentive in this market, in energy, not so much in healthcare, I've learned, but in energy, if there's an economic incentive, industry will jump on it, and they'll bring it to market. And that's one of the reasons that the 1970s energy problem doesn't exist anymore, but the 1970s healthcare problem does. And storage is really the holy grail. And I don't mean just batteries, I mean geothermal, all sorts of really cool, interesting ways of storing electricity. Dan Nocera has a very cool leaf he's working on, and I'd gladly talk more about that. The policy tool chest we have for affecting price, though, really three things. One, regulate. We don't think of regulations as a form of price control, but that's essentially what they are. If you impose regulations on firms, this is why firms hate them, it raises the marginal cost of producing whatever they're producing from that input. Massachusetts versus EPA is a very, very important case in recent Supreme Court lore. It gives the EPA the right to regulate carbon under the Clean Air Act, even though carbon is not specified under the Clean Air Act as a pollutant. In other words, it gives the EPA the right to specify what is and is not a pollutant and to regulate it. This is extremely important. It was challenged, that right was challenged, and the Roberts Court, for all that people lay at the feet of the Roberts Court for faults, the Roberts Court sided with the EPA. Said, you have that right, go forth. And EPA currently is setting rules to regulate carbon. It'll take them 5-6 years to get those rules, at the minimum, into place. In addition, 30 states have renewable portfolio standards. That is some requirement that there be a minimum use of alternative energies. Second way to regulate is to price. You can impose energy taxes. $25 a month on electricity or $1 a gallon on gas would do the trick nicely. Or you can have cap and trade. We have California implementing it right now, and the Northeast has it already. Europe has it. It'll probably grow. The problem with cap and trade, though, if you go back to the previous slide, is it's only going to affect that little bit. So I think the cap and trade bill wasn't ripe for a very important reason. It missed the fact that the present value of carbon costs is sufficiently low that the price that would be afforded on the market is not going to capture much of the difference between natural gas and coal, and certainly not going to capture the difference between solar and wind and coal. Solar is roughly 5 times coal. Wind, 2 to 3. Nuclear, about 2. So if we make that, the first thing that's going to be competitive if we increase prices is not solar power. It is not wind power. It is nuclear power. That's a very difficult discussion we're going to have over the next few years. And then finally, the other way to increase effective prices is research and development. ARPA-E was a big initiative, still in its infancy, really. I think corporations are going to do far more than the federal government will ever do in this domain. Federal investment will be a chump change. So what are the solutions? The healthcare story with ACA is a big change story. The energy story is an incremental story, and there are 2 different ways to attack the policy problem. And I'm not sure that big change is the right way to go, but we'll see how this plays out. So what I do is public opinion research, and I think the right incremental approach from a political perspective is to follow the public, and that's what the Obama administration is doing right now. They are following very closely what the public is thinking. If you ask people, what energy source do you want to use in the future? 80% support wind and solar. So renewable portfolio standard seems like an easy kind of policy to put in place. And 30 states have them. 60% want to use less oil and coal. In fact, over the last decade, oil has plunged to the bottom of the since we started surveying in this area, oil has plunged to the least popular source of energy. And on the climate question itself, you just ask people about climate, they're of 2 minds. Most people, pretty large majority, are concerned or very concerned about the climate. But when you ask them, are you willing to pay, say, $5 more a month on your electricity bill if it solved climate? Or $10, or $25, or $75, or $100 more. $100 would be great if you really wanted to go after coal. That's kind of what you need to do to bring, say, wind into the picture. People don't go for it. The modal answer is 0. The median answer is $5 more. $5 is 5% of the electricity difference. It's not going to take you very far to eliminate those differences. That is an example of an unsustainable policy. It would be reversed pretty quickly. So climate policy itself is not very sellable. So when we ask people why they want to use solar and why they don't want to use coal, they give a pretty simple answer. In fact, it's the same answer for every energy source. People will favor energy sources that they think are cheap and that they think are clean. And they really like things that are clean. And by clean, they don't mean the climate. By clean, they mean air and water pollution, especially water pollution. They're willing to pay for water pollution, much more than they're willing to pay to solve the climate problem. The climate problem does not drive people's preferences about energy in the United States. Local environmental concerns do. That's a really key insight. This is all pushing us toward the same insight that Mike Greenstone and Adam Looney have, which is the big payoff is in pricing the non-climate costs associated with energy production. Let's go after, in an aggressive way, the co-pollutants of carbon. So what's happening right now is we have a series of state-level policies that are targeting the price problem from the perspective of their local ecology. So California is going after cap and trade, the Northeast is going after cap and trade, the rest of the country not so excited. Texas and Iowa lead the country in wind. Right? Texas is way ahead of the rest of the country in wind, right? Because they decided that they wanted a renewable portfolio standard. They have a lot of wind in Texas. It's very hot in Texas. There's a problem with wind in Texas that we've learned, which has been fascinating to watch it unfold, which is that the wind blows at night when people don't use their energy. Right? So at night, the introduction of wind, very sudden introduction of wind into the energy mix in Texas has had a very perverse effect. It's caused the price of electricity at night in Texas to become negative. What do you do when the price is negative? If I'm a consumer, I turn on the air conditioner and I open the window and I reduce my electricity bill. And that's what people are doing in parts of Texas. This is the need for storage. If we solve the storage problem, it makes wind competitive. If we don't solve the storage problem, because wind is most intense at night, it's never going to make it. The federal government has begun its process of regulating, but that's not where the big payoff is going to be. The big payoff is going to be the same, and Mike and I came to the same conclusion quite independently, which is to regulate the co-pollutants of carbon. Regulate mercury, regulate particulates, and be very aggressive. And that, believe it or not, is exactly what the Obama administration turns out to be doing right now. So in this very incremental way, we've all converged to the same idea of what policy has to be in this domain. This is the example of a policy being ripe. Everybody agrees. The academics, the pollsters, the economists, the climate scientists see this, the environmentalists, the ecologists see it. So everybody's converged on the same thing. Do you need a big law for this? No. All the architecture's already in place. It just takes political will from the leaders. Going back to our earlier discussion. But the price isn't going to be enough. We're going to need a lot of innovation, things like storage. And also utilization. And I just want to end by giving a shout out to my colleague, Steve Coonan, who has begun what I think is the most fascinating and exciting energy project in the United States. And it's called CUSP, the Center for Urban Science and Progress. It sounds like it's 1910 with a title like that rather than 2010. But CUSP is to take the entire city of New York and turn it into a laboratory. Why? Because the kind of technological innovation for energy use at a big scale has got to be at a big scale. This is the ecology we have to study in order to learn how to improve the efficiency of energy use. How do you create storage in New York City? Can you structure markets differently that'll share energy in some smarter way? Well, to even begin to start to research that, you have to collect data. So what Steve has done, Steve was the provost at Caltech, director of energy research under Obama, and he just took on this fantastic position, is he has convinced the mayor of New York to give him the Met Tech campus in the center of Brooklyn and the Brooklyn Naval Yard to be his playground. And they are building things out. So this is a fantastic opportunity if anybody's interested in big data, informatics, really cracking into research in a big way. They're just getting off the ground. Microsoft is their biggest sponsor, followed by Lutron, which used to be Lucent. All the tech firms are flocking to this idea and this activity. And this is the way to really start to generate a lot of excitement about solving a lot of these energy utilization problems in a really creative way. And the nice thing about it is it's nestled in the university, but with the partnership of the public sector from the mayor's office and the corporate sector. And you really have to have all three parts playing together to accelerate the rate of innovation that we're going to need. There are similar projects beginning in Toronto, Tokyo, and London, and I must say this makes me so excited and so hopeful for what we're going to be able to do over the next decade or 2 decades that I really think we're going to crack this problem in a way that we cracked the 1970s energy problems. The 1970s energy problems were effectively solved. And I think we're going to be able to do it with carbon. We may not eliminate carbon, but I think we'll be able to bend the curve because the technologies that are developed here in the US are going to be immediately exportable to the places that really need it because the growth in energy production in the world is not going to be in the US and it's not going to be in Europe. It's going to be in China, it's going to be in India, it's going to be in Brazil, it's going to be in Indonesia, it's going to be in Malaysia, and eventually in Africa. And that technology has to be ready to go, and we're the lab. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? I'd like to ask a question that has 6 sentences as part of the question, because I'm so excited about this.
Okay, I better start writing.
No, well, it's not that hard, because you've already thought about it. I'm 100% sure. So imagine that you want to do what George Post did start at the Biodesign Institute in Arizona, at ASU, in collaboration with BP, and that was this thing that they called Tubes in the Desert. And I want to link that to Ed Bateke's talk today, and then you can tell me to stop. But I guess since it's my symposium,
think about that.
I'm going to tell you how. I mean, he didn't say that, and I'm linking this to Nestle's dream, but it's the Nestle dream I made up. That is, I don't know anything about Nestle's dreams, but I know my dream, and I want to ask you if this makes sense. Okay, I promise I won't take too much longer.
Right.
Imagine that you conjoined all those activities so that you've used your fracking natural gas, fracking being an activity, not
As
my
opposed
usual
to like
use, like
bending the curse word, yeah.
yes. So that's right. So you've now got really good power plants that are throwing less stuff up per BTU or whatever the language is, and when the CO2 comes out, right on the roof where they're burning all that stuff, it goes into the big photosynthetic fermenters, and you make creatures, photosynthetic creatures, rich in the protein we're running out of anyway as food, and that gets put into little bricks like yeast from beer plants and shipped to Lausanne for Ed to supplement with the nutritional things we need, and the food chemists across the street in Nestle make it look like crab cakes or whatever they're gonna do.
That's a B, right?
Yeah, it's the B, right. And so the real question is, could you reduce carbon? So this is a solar program,
Yeah.
but it's a solar program of reducing the CO2 to protein eventually so that you solve the food problem and the energy problem simultaneously. Are there wackos saying that?
This is exactly the project, very close to the project. The first half, it's the project that my colleague Mike Aziz at Harvard is working on. He hasn't started making beer bricks, but beer bricks sounds like something you shoot on Friday afternoons. But, if Nestle wants to approach Mike Aziz, Mike would be more than willing to take the next step. Right? So, yeah, Mike is working on how do you put solar collectors on top of our waste heat, basically, to start to produce systems that will capture the carbon in a way that can sequester the carbon that's coming out.
We have a question back here.
Hi, thank you very much for talking about the analogy between energy policy and healthcare. I think if you took your graph from the Kaiser Foundation on healthcare cost increase and also included a graph of the obesity problem in the United States, you'd see a direct correlation. You also talk about policy in terms of energy policy, but I didn't see demand-side management as part of that policy mix. And if you look in the state of Oregon and Vermont, their demand-side management has significantly reduced their carbon footprint. I guess could you talk about demand-side management on both healthcare and nutritional policy, as our friend from Nestle was talking about? How do we decrease obesity, and also how do we decrease the use of energy as part of an analogous process?
Yeah, I just don't know anything about how to decrease obesity. Just get up and walk around more. Actually, my comment for the Nestle, I was struck that maybe they've done this, but Nestle hadn't done an exercise experiment. They'd done a food experiment, but they hadn't done an exercise experiment. That would have been cool to do, and that would be closer to energy use because that's related to transportation. The whole idea behind CUSP is demand side. Right? So the first thing they did, actually, was collect all the data on every cab pickup and drop-off in the city of New York. Every cab pickup and drop-off for a year to try to get a sense of, who's using energy, who's not using energy, who's using petroleum in the city, and how do we start to manage that. The next thing they're going to try to do is monitor every building in the city of New York to figure out where the waste heat loss is. Which are there buildings that are just belching heat out, right? Those are all demand issues. There are a ton of complicated issues around that. I just blew through it quickly in my slides, but that was sort of number one on the objectives was the price will change the demand. there have been a lot of these kind of behavioral economics experiments where you show people how much they're using. There's an immediate effect, and then it goes back down. Right? So telling people, here's how much you use, here's how much your neighbor uses, they sort of listen for a couple months, and then they say, oh, well, I can't do anything about that. And there's a big problem, at least in residential use, which is how long you stay in your house. It doesn't pay to do anything major to your house if you're only going to be in there for 5 years or so. And that's already kind of getting out there. So one of the big demand side problems is how do we internalize the time perspective, which I think is really what is common to the health and the energy problem, which is on the demand side, how do we get people to appreciate the time value and internalize that in decisions they make today about their houses. Let me give you an example. Why isn't it in the building code of Colorado that every new building has solar panels on it? I can imagine why it wouldn't be in Massachusetts, because it's terrible. Like, the efficiency's awful. And there would be costs to your building. But why isn't it part of your zoning code? And there are some municipalities that are starting to put that in. But that would be an example of a kind of demand-side management that could be done by state or city government.
I love the approach of bending the curve by regulating co-pollutants, but I wonder if you could comment on the potential risks of intentionally distorting the economics to not reflect the totality of the cost. And particularly what I'm thinking about, if I'm a big energy producer and those regulations come into effect and the price reflects that, then I immediately see that, gee, I can easily game the system and emit as much carbon as I need to reduce mercury emissions or whatever you co-regulate. And that's not the desired goal. Is there a way to avoid those kind of risks?
Well, in parallel, we have to have EPA is propagating greenhouse gas. So that's the efficient way is the effective way is to do it all at once. It's not the most efficient way. Regulation drives my economics friends up the wall. But there's because it's so inefficient, right? Like, you can't transfer wealth between or allow people to trade. But it's really popular. So from my perspective, I care about how sustainable the politics are, not how sustainable the economics are. I'll let Mike worry about that. The sustainability of the politics, though, are fantastic for regulation. 80% of the public supports EPA regulating carbon. Right? 80%. 25% support any kind of meaningful carbon tax. Right? Like, okay. They like the inefficient regulation, that's what they're going to get.
We have a question right here.
Hi.
Hi, I wanted to ask you a question about the long-term policy of what you're addressing for energy. There's a program, a presentation I'd seen from a professor at MIT about 3 years ago, and he projected out to about 2050, and basically the energy demand for population with an average GDP growth over the long term. And he said basically you couldn't supply enough energy through nuclear if you built a nuclear plant every day. And he said the only way to solve that is through solar. And basically I think fracking is just a short-term stopgap until you find another cleaner alternative, because he showed that even with fracking and carbon sequestration underground, it's very minimal compared to the output that's going to be.
Right, fracking is just going to buy us time for technological innovation, and it's also going to allow us to get off of some of the older, worse coal technologies. Another idea of Mike's, actually, is the federal government should buy the 100 oldest coal power plants and tear them down, because their emissions per unit of BTU are out the roof. So, well, the old ones are still operating because the marginal cost of operating that plant is about zero compared, because of the financial burden, so there's no capital cost associated with that. So industry loves that because that's a freebie. It's the intermediate age plants that are getting torn down.
You talk about the benefits of fracking. What about the downside? What about the dangers? I'm not hearing about that, and the threat to the environment, not to mention health.
So this is very interesting because this is exactly the point of conflict and tension within the environmental community, which is, are you going to value carbon or are you going to value wastewater, which is mainly what that's the main downside of fracking, management of wastewater. If EPA gets, or the state regulators get aggressive about wastewater, then they can start to manage this. And there's also some methane emissions and so forth that need to be managed as well, and some tailings issues. So those need to be managed locally and aggressively, and they can be done with fairly modest cost compared to the cost differential on the price of gas. So gas will still remain competitive after those regulations are put in place. That infrastructure doesn't exist. But the fact that one part of the environmental community is upset about the water and the other part's upset about carbon, and they're at odds with each other, is a fundamental tension within the environmental community. We're seeing the same fight over nuclear power. Greenpeace basically got torn in half over nuclear power, over the carbon issue. So these two issues, the sort of local traditional waste issues, mainly with water, but also with air pollution, and some with toxic waste, and carbon, are really dividing the environmental community in some fundamental ways.
Stephen, thank you very,
Thank you.
very much. Excellent.